Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak about James Barry. In 1763, an ambitious young man from Cork arrived in Dublin on the eve of an exhibition of paintings at the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. Founded in 1731, the Dublin Society represented efforts by members of the Protestant landed classes to ennoble and improve the Irish nation, both in mercantile and moral terms. Accompanied only by a similarly youthful school friend, and without so much as a letter of recommendation or introduction, the 22-year-old James Barry presented his own painting to the Society, who were sufficiently impressed by this unknown to hang his canvas amongst the assembled works. Though no catalogue of the 1763 exhibition has survived, we can imagine from the lists of works exhibited in subsequent years by the Society of Artists what kind of images might have been on display as attendees gathered the following day. An indicative selection here will give you a sense of the styles and techniques emerging amongst Irish artists during the 1760s. Viewers would surely have seen the fruits of the formation in 1746 of a school of drawing supported by the Dublin Society. Here, pupils such as Hugh Douglas Hamilton were instructed by artist Robert West, who had trained in France under Francois Boucher to draw figures in chalk in the French Rococo style. Visible too was the naturalistic influence of artists from the Low Countries, many of whom had arrived in Ireland following the persecution of Huguenots, and who brought with them skills as artists and artisans. Particularly prized was the classical Italianate style, which artists refined through visits to Rome, where they could see artworks by the ancients as well as by the Renaissance masters. Visitors to the 1763 exhibition would also have seen an Irish art world beginning to find confidence in its own visual identity, concurrent with a growing political optimism and appetite for self-determination. They would have seen an array of works in oil and watercolour by a burgeoning Dublin school of landscape painters, featuring picturesque vistas of country estates and their parklands, as well as more sublime scenes of plunging waterfalls and craggy mountains. Also on display were portraits of the elite of Dublin society, its parliamentarians, philanthropists, landlords and gentlemen improvers, rendered in miniature to act as portable keepsakes, as well as in life-size to adorn the country's entrance halls and drawing rooms. History paintings depicting mythological, classical and religious scenes were considered the most elevated genre amongst the hierarchies of painting, and these too featured in Irish exhibitions of the 1760s, though artists found fewer patrons to support these works. As the Society's exhibition opened to the public, the story goes that one painting in particular commanded the attention of visitors who flocked around James Barry's canvas. His work, The Baptism of the King of Cashel by St. Patrick, now damaged and reduced, depicted a scene from Ireland's historic past. This episode was recorded in Foras Fassa Éireann, an antiquarian text published by Geoffrey Keating in 1634 and translated into English in 1723 as the General History of Ireland. A dynamic, powerful composition, Barry's painting reflected the high-minded ambitions of its artist, who sought, through art, to elevate the civic and moral character of the nation, and in depicting this episode, rendered the earliest example on canvas of a scene from Irish history. Following Keating's account, which Barry had carefully copied out into his commonplace book, alongside similar accounts of Ireland's ancient and mythological past, the painting depicts an episode from the life of St. Patrick. The venerable saint was travelling throughout Munster when Angus, the pagan king of Cashel, sought to convert and to be received into the Christian faith. Pictured here is the moment of baptism, as Angus, surrounded by his retinue, bows his head in devotion and is anointed. However, during the ceremony, St. Patrick accidentally drives the stake of his bishop's crosier through the foot of the pagan king, causing immense pain as blood pours from the wound. Angus, unfamiliar with the ceremony of baptism, imagines this to be part of the ceremony, but stoically bears his agony, such is the depth of his reverence. On the right-hand side, St. Patrick is depicted, according to post-Tridentan conventions, as an elderly, bearded figure wearing a bishop's mitre. The pagan king, meanwhile, is clothed all'antica, with the draped fabric and shoulder epaulets of classical military attire. His breadth and wide stance suggest his strength and vitality, embodying the nobility of an ancient age. While one can imagine the stir that a painting like this, so replete with violence and vitality, caused as it appeared to a Dublin audience in 1763. As exhibition goers gathered around the painting in fascination and admiration, they wondered who could possibly have painted it. The young Cork man, James Barry, emerged from the crowd and declared himself the artist of the painting, to the sheer disbelief of the assembled viewers. Eventually, his school friend stepped in and vouched for Barry as the maker of the work, upon which he was awarded a premium for history painting. A group of 3 parliamentarians purchased the painting for the House of Commons, where it hung in what is now the Bank of Ireland on College Green in Dublin, until it was damaged in a fire in 1792, resulting in the reduced version, which eventually ended up in Terenure College, Dublin. The members of Ireland's 18th century Parliament who purchased this work recognised the political potency of the composition. For parliamentarians, St. Patrick represented both a symbol of Irish patriotism and a proto-Protestantism to which they sought to position themselves as the rightful inheritors. For Barry, the painting represented the pinnacle of his aspirations for Ireland, the fusion of Christian devotion represented by the August saint, and the restoration of the heroism and nobility of an earlier age, personified in the determined stoicism of the pagan king and reinforced through the stigmatic associations of the wounded foot. And so to come eventually to the title of this paper, quote, "It is well known that Cork is no school of painting," not my words, I hasten to add, but rather an excerpt from a profile of James Barry, published in the 1800-1801 edition of Public Characters, an annual volume profiling cultural and political figures published during Barry's erratic and disappointed final years. What influences in Barry's youth in Cork created in him one of the most significant artists of 18th century Britain and Ireland? Painter, draftsman, printmaker, theorist, critic, polemicist, maker of the most significant scheme of history paintings of his day at London's Royal Society of Arts, a major source of inspiration to fellow artists William Blake and Henry Fuseli, and correspondent of philosopher Edmund Burke, and, as mentioned, Professor of Painting at the Royal Academy, and until 2004, the only academician ever to be expelled from that institution. James Barry was born on the 11th of October 1741 in a small cottage in Water Lane, now Seminary Road, Cork, illustrated here with a sketch by Crofton Croker from Barry's entry in Strickland's Dictionary of Irish Artists. He was the eldest child of Juliana Reardon and John Barry, and was followed by 3 brothers, Patrick, Redmond and John, and a sister, Mary Ann, who would later become the mother of Dr. James Barry. Barry's mother was a devout Catholic who instructed her children in that tradition, and his father a Protestant, although seemingly Barry Sr.'s connection with the established church was less as a result of theological conviction and more as a pragmatic response to the penal laws which constrained the participation of Catholics from public life. The Barry family embodied the complexities of social position and opportunity in mid-18th century Ireland. By family tradition, the Reardon side were members of the dispossessed Catholic gentry. The Barry side of the family, meanwhile, had arrived in Ireland via Wales as part of the 12th century Norman invasion, with some branches of the family flourishing to the extent that they came to possess such fine residences as 16th century Barry's Court Castle, pictured here, and later Fota House. John Barry, James's father, was entrepreneurially minded, operating as a builder, coastal trader, and as the proprietor of an inn on the Cork Quays, though was never made a free man of the city. Much has been made of Barry's humble origins. The acerbic critic and chronicler of 18th century artists, Anthony Pasquin, noted that Barry in his early life was, quote, wont to carry the hod for his bricklayer father. While Barry's family background, therefore, did not necessarily suggest an artistic career, it is clear that the young Barry was profoundly influenced by the classical and religious intellectual environment to which he was exposed, particularly through his association with Catholic priests. The importance of these biblical and mythological references to which he was exposed is demonstrated by the list of works which he is recorded as having painted while still in Cork: Aeneas escaping with his family from the flames of Troy, A Dead Christ, Susanna and the Elders, Daniel in the Lion's Den, Abraham's Sacrifice. Regrettably, none of these early works can now be traced, though I'm doing my best, but their subjects demonstrate the early emergence of Barry's esoteric interest in biblical and classical subjects, along with his moral ambitions for painting, which would reach their fullest expression in later works, including The Temptation of Adam in the National Gallery of Ireland collection, in which the artist's monumental sculptural figure painting heightens the sense of exposure and shame felt by Adam and Eve after their fall from Eden. In addition to the influence of his Catholic mother, Barry's early talent brought him to the attention of enlightened patrons in Cork. Two of the most significant of these were Dr. John Longfield and Dr. Joseph Fenn Slay. In his biographical account of Barry, Pasquin writes, somewhat hyperbolically, that the young Barry came to the attention of Dr. Longfield following Barry's painting A Sign of Neptune for a whisky shop in Cork, which was, quote, a production so uncommon for a lad situated as he was, that Dr. Longfield immediately put his ample wing over him and rescued him from meanness, penury, and oblivion. Slay, who is recorded here in the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland's Kirkpatrick Index, was not only a school friend of Edmund Burke, but had also befriended writer Oliver Goldsmith, author of The Deserted Village and She Stoops to Conquer, during the poet's period in Edinburgh as a reluctant medical student. Barry's early friendship with Slay, which he sustained through correspondence after leaving Ireland, also resulted in his friendship with Edmund Burke, whose ideas about sublime beauty had fired the young artist's imagination before he had ever met the philosopher. The formative support that Barry received from these patrons was intellectual as well as financial. These doctors participated in a vibrant literary culture in Cork, cultivating extensive personal libraries, corresponding and publishing on matters including science and astronomy, and subscribing to support the publication of important classical and literary texts. For a curious and ambitious young man such as Barry, exposure to this milieu undoubtedly played a significant role in his ideological formation and in the conviction he felt throughout his life in his views on art, culture, and moral cultivation. Barry's earliest visual influences are also significant in understanding the artist that he would become, and in that regard, none played a more significant role than John Butts, a Cork artist who also trained landscape painter Thomas Roberts and genre painter Nathaniel Grogan, as well as Barry. Particularly skilled in landscape painting, Butts's own work echoed the luminosity and atmosphere of French Baroque landscapist Claude Lorraine, whom artists strove to emulate for his richly textured and tonally restrained Arcadian vistas. Upon hearing the news of Butts's premature death at age 37, following a lifetime of poverty, Barry wrote of his former tutor, quote, a character which is dear to me as a great artist, a fellow citizen, and whose example and works were my first guide and was what enamoured me with the art itself. Towards the end of his life, Barry returned to the topic of St. Patrick, believing his early version of this subject to have been destroyed in the House of Commons fire. Alienated from his fellow artists and would-be patrons, and frustrated by the lack of appetite for great history painting, Barry sought to respond to the 1798 rebellion and the ensuing Act of Union using his earlier subject of the conversion and baptism of the pagan king by Ireland's national saint. A preparatory oil sketch of this work survives in the collection of the National Gallery of Ireland, and despite damage to the early work, the changes made to the second version are evident. Most visibly, the focus has shifted from the youthful pagan king to the elder saint. While the pagan King Angus remains athletic-looking, his military attire has now been replaced with rags, suggesting that Barry now sought to emphasise the primacy of Christian devotion over the pagan grandeur of previous ages. Here, the king inclines his head to the saint rather than meeting his gaze as an equal, as in the earlier work, as Barry sought to reprimand as well as to inspire an age which he felt had lost its moral way. The landscape in which the scene is set also merits investigation. It is evident that the original canvas has been cut due to the fire damage it sustained, and I suspect that an additional upper third formed the original work, indicated here in red, meaning that both works would have been square. While we can't know what background details Barry included in the early work, in the latter version, the scene in which it is set is as significant as the figure painting that serves as the focal point. Doric columns on the left-hand side of the painting respond to the Stonehenge, which appears on the distant hills as emblematic of the strength of Britain and Ireland's druidical past. The Doric columns, meanwhile, signal Barry's claims for the nobility of Ireland's ancient past, equivalent, he claimed, to the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. The specifically Doric nature of this ancient architecture, as the earliest form of classical column, suggests Barry's view that Ireland was ripe for the renewal of this grandeur, and his belief that this could be achieved through the union of Christian faith and the heroic ancient past. The resonance that this subject matter retained for Barry throughout his life demonstrates the artist's understanding of the role of art in enlightening and edifying the public. It is significant that he returned to Irish subject matter in the final decade of his life, disappointed by the constrained ambitions of his artistic peers and responding to the upheaval of the United Irish Rebellion and the ensuing Act of Union. Barry was optimistic that this would lead to Catholic emancipation and the flowering of a new age of toleration, liberty, and justice. In 1800, he wrote to William Pitt, quote, "I have made a design for a picture on the subject of the happy union of Great Britain and Ireland, which union has long been the desideratum of all well-informed and good people, and was unfortunately overlooked and neglected in the reign of King James I. In these two symbolically laden designs, the sister kingdoms of Britannia and Hibernia embrace, as justice balances her scales." Barry's ambitions for his own artistic renewal were therefore linked in his final disillusioned years with his aspiration that the Irish nation might reclaim its lost splendour. In sum, Barry's early years in Cork, painting subjects of classical and esoteric ambition, as well as whisky shop signs, may well have been an unlikely place of origin for the great history painting of his generation. However, the idiosyncratic political and intellectual culture of his upbringing in fact imbued the artist with a profound sense of moral conviction and artistic zeal. Supported by a cultural milieu whose interests were curious and cosmopolitan, and who recognised the profound talent of the unlikely young artist, while mid-18th century Cork may have been no school of painting, it certainly was, in the case of James Barry, a school of art. Thank you.